History is built by war. Has any other real-time strategy game or RTS come even close to the scope of Total War? Sure, games like Company of Heroes and King's Crusade do give you some similar gameplay, but the idea of being able to march your armies across stretches of land as you grow the economic power of your empire is an exhilarating experience provided solely by Total War. And because it's a PC-only franchise, each entry has tremendously upped the scale from its predecessors, to the points where you can now have tens of thousands of soldiers duke it out on the battlefield, stretching miles and miles and miles. But with a semi-yearly release schedule, has the formula gotten predictable? Are the developers maybe strained out? Is each game actually distinct, or do they all kind of blend together and simply look different thanks to the different time periods associated with each game? We're here to answer that and more as we look into this great and terrible franchise, Total War. Kicking it off with this badass cinematic scene, the Total War series established itself in 2000 with its first entry, Shogun. Shogun was, in a lot of ways, the Donkey Kong Country of the RTS genre, if you will, as it showed off the amazing effects 3D graphics could have on a game. It was one of the first times ever where you could mobilize armies in a real-time setting, and with 8 factions to choose from, there was a lot of variety, albeit more so aesthetically. Not everything was perfect, of course. A lot of the systematic problems present in Shogun would go on to appear in its follow-ups despite changes in the game engine. The biggest was, of course, the poor diplomatic system, which in the blink of an eye could see you at war with the rest of the world, for just no reason whatsoever. Another notable one was the fact that every building you constructed remained prone to enemy attacks, with no way of individually defending them short of placing your military in front of it. And outside of battling, there was really just not much to do except growing your farm, so we all turned into farmers in the original Shogun, but an amazing game to start off the franchise. Now, the first medieval Total War was when the series got its trademark Eurasia map. While Shogun had limited players to Japan, Medieval expanded to include parts of Europe, the Middle East, and even North Africa. And with naval warfare added to make travel more dangerous. Not to mention the fact that there was a new campaign mode called the Glorious Achievements that made victory possible through the completion of missions instead of just conquering territory. But Medieval also kept a lot of the drawbacks from Shogun. Despite releasing 2 years later, it retained the same engine, meaning graphically it just looked outdated at the time. This would be a trend that would continue game after game after game. As well as the repeat use of assets game over, and we can see that in Medieval by way of the replacement units for the priests and the daimyos, essentially the same as in Shogun. Now, when Rome came around, it was, in my opinion, the first modern entry in this esteemed franchise. With the new TW Engine 2, it looked beautiful, much different from the first 2 games. Voice acting was added as well to give battles a sense of gravitas, and units seemed to have more diversity to them, such as the Screaming Women, the Head Throwers, and the Berserkers. But what made Rome so great was its implementation of cause and effect. Buildings weren't just there to look pretty, they had a purpose. Academias ensured that corruption didn't enter state governments, sewers prevented disease from spreading, coliseums kept the populace happy. It was nice to have additional elements to consider as you grew your civilization through conventional warfare, and this was not possible in the first 2 games. Moving along to Medieval 2, it was essentially just a graphical updated version of the original Medieval. Not much was changed at all gameplay-wise, but man, it was nice to see knights actually look like round characters this time around. Yeah, they looked pretty bad in the original game. New aspects like merchants and a Crusaders-style finale helped keep the game somewhat fresh, but many old problems continued to prevail. Religious conversion was biased towards the Christian factions over the pagan and Muslim ones, making it easier to play as them. And while the AI systems were fine during the initial campaign, their simplicity became very noticeable as you stretched your reach across the sprawling overworld. Units that didn't take orders stood around like fools or just ran wherever they wanted to. Once again, another issue that Total War would have problems with to this very day. In 2009, Empire Total War burst onto the scene as the next big step for the series. Featuring gunpowder as the primary fighting mechanic, Empire moved the action focus to long range, meaning battles now resembled a type of modern warfare. The playpen was also extended to include all of India, Central America, and the New World. Empire also, for the very first time, fleshed out naval warfare to include actual real-time combat scenarios, giving gamers control over a formerly AI-run part. But Empire also brought forward a problem that would not be fixed until Warhammer II, and that was the invincibility factor. Once you get to a point where your taxpayers are supplying enough revenue, you essentially become unbeatable, even when you were faced against multiple huge nations. Now Napoleon was up next, more or less the same as Empire though with a much smaller map focused just on Europe. While particle effects, attrition factors, and even real generals were added, it played, like I said, very similar to Empire, so let's go ahead and move on to the next game in the series, Shogun II. Shogun II marked a new brand in Creative Assembly's franchise. Returning to their roots, the company had made some very impressive changes. The seasonal system was much more dynamic. You had to do more than just occupy a populace to win them over, and religious conversion became mandatory to maintaining a stable kingdom. Not much else needs to be said about Shogun II. With its gorgeous depiction of feudal Japan, Shogun II was ultimately a very great entry in the series, probably the fan favorite if you ask many people. Rome II is best remembered for two things: its bugs at launch and the blood and gore DLC. The latter is kind of amusing given that fan mods were made for this purpose long before Sega got on board, but the glitches were inexcusable. It took over a year for Rome II to be made playable, and by then people had already moved on to the next entry, Attila. It was ridiculous, especially for a developer with an otherwise good reputation. But the ironic part was, with the fixes in place, Rome II is honestly a really great game. Sure, the UI is more complicated than the previous entries, but getting used to it is kind of part of the fun in Rome II. And the removal of the family tree system from the original ensures that you don't have to waste time sending family members out everywhere under the risk of getting them killed, which happened all the frickin' time in Rome I. Nonetheless, the game was soon forgotten by the follow-up Attila, changing the campaign from one of conquering to one of essentially survival. Attila brought new mechanics that reinvigorated the series. Aspects like religion, technology, food supplies, and government offices became important to not only grow your faction, but also prevent strife and civil war. Diving into all the new changes would be deserving of its own video, but nonetheless, Attila was a very pleasant surprise for Total War fans. Remember back in the day when Kingdom Hearts was seen as the strangest video game mashup? Well, Total War Warhammer definitely has that beat. While the Warhammer series has achieved nothing short of acclaim since its tabletop days from the 80s, combining this traditional RPG with an RTS like Total War seemed really bizarre. But man oh man, was I wrong. Warhammer only gives you 4 factions to choose from, seems a little bit tight from the get-go, but the amount of unit variety there not only puts Rome I to shame, but also gives players new types of strategies that just weren't possible with historically accurate armies. Giant orcs, sorcerers, flying monsters, the different tactics available with all of these unit types are just amazing. You could tell a lot of heart was put into this game. Out of all the iteration of the games and all the changes that are coming to the new Warhammer sequel, the one that really stands out has got to be the campaign vortex. You know how in Civilization games there are multiple victory conditions? A technology victory, a military victory, and so forth? Those are finally being implemented into the Total War series, where factions now have a chance of beating you even if you own half the world. It resolves the problem I stated in Empire, where you eventually come to a point where you are unbeatable in conventional warfare. Nonetheless, Warhammer 2 and its inevitable sequel will finish off this fantasy trilogy until the series goes back to historical settings. In that regard, we can only hope Sega and Creative Assembly make more changes to keep their brand relevant and fresh. It's a series that is both great and terrible, epic and problematic, but one that I truly believe stands out above the rest. And in that regard, Total War is ultimately an awesome series for a very specific person. But hey, you don't have to have me tell you how to feel about Total War, so drop a comment down below and tell us how you feel about this iconic real-time strategy series. But before I go, I just want to stop for a second and say thank you to everyone who supports the work I do on this channel, whether you thumbs the videos up, whether you're a subscriber, or whether you are one of my patrons. It's been a very hard time lately on YouTube. All of my videos are becoming demonetized. Every single time I upload a video, it gets demonetized before I even publish it for you guys to watch. I don't know why this is happening. I think my videos are literally the opposite of the archetype for demonetization, but it's happening nonetheless every single video. So if you're out there and you love what I do, then I just want to say thank you. So you guys have a great day, and we'll see you on our next video.